Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's Tim Richter here with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Welcome to our Vote Housing webinar with special guest Nick Nanos from Nanos Research to talk about the details of a poll that we have commissioned with his company on housing and homelessness in Canada. I'm very excited to share the results of this poll with all of you. So first off, just want to talk a bit about today's session. This is our agenda. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items and review our agenda. We're going to hear from a couple of our partners, Jill Atke and Richard Odette. And then we're going to hear from Nick from Nanos Research. And then we'll do a question and answer period and discussion on some of the results of the poll that we'll be talking about today. So just a few housekeeping items. First of all, just to let you know, everyone is muted. So we've got a lot of people on the call today. Everyone is going to be muted, but please feel free to use the chat to say hello, to comment on the comment on what you hear and what you see, and talk to your peers during the call. Generally, the chat gets really busy during these webinars, and so it's kind of hard for me to keep up with if there's any questions in the chat. So we're going to ask everybody, if you have a question, please use the Q&A to ask questions of the presenters. And also to let you know that there is simultaneous interpretation available today. So if you want to get access to this in French, or you need translation into French, simultaneous interpretation is available by pushing the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. So I want to introduce first the Vote Housing campaign really briefly. So the basics are that the Vote Housing campaign is a national nonpartisan campaign to end homelessness and housing need in Canada. It's led by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, and the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, and powered by all of you. You know, when we talk about our mission and the work that we're trying to achieve with this campaign, it boils down to something that many of you will have heard me say before, that homelessness and housing need in Canada was created by policy. And so if we are to end homelessness and address housing need in Canada, we need to reverse the policies that created it in the first place. And so that means we have to get engaged in the political process, and we have to make sure that politicians of all parties see and hear from Canadians that ending homelessness and addressing Canada's housing crisis are a key priority, and that is the mission of the Vote Housing campaign. And we're aiming to create the largest nonpartisan housing advocacy campaign in Canadian history by mobilizing thousands of Canadians to pledge to vote housing in the upcoming federal election. And you'll be happy to know the results of this poll show that public opinion is squarely with us. And that is really, really critical. And that's really important. But, you know, change doesn't happen because we want it to happen. Change doesn't happen because it ought to happen. Change only happens because we make it happen. And that's where all of you will come in. And before I get into introducing Nick and the results of the poll, I wanted to introduce a couple of our partners, Jill Atke from the BC Nonprofit Housing Association and Richard Odette from FESHIM. And so I will now turn it over to Jill from BC NPHA. Welcome, Jill.
Thanks very much, Tim, and well, it's officially afternoon here in BC as well, so good afternoon to everybody on the line. And thanks for the opportunity to just spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about why we've decided to join the campaign and why it's important to us and the work that we do. So I'm here on behalf of BC Nonprofit Housing Association, but in BC, we often, almost always work in really close collaboration with the Aboriginal Housing Management Association and the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC. And this campaign's no different. So we're working very, very closely with those two organizations. We've teamed up to join the campaign for a really simple reason. And it's one that probably is going to sound cliche, but we really are stronger together. We've had that experience here in British Columbia, and it's just fantastic to see it happening nationally as well. So there's many voices in housing advocacy. That's absolutely a good thing. But when we as a sector come together, do the work of finding common ground and speaking to government or to political parties with one voice, it means that they don't have to do that work, and they're more likely to listen to us, and they're more likely to act. So that's really the fundamental reason we've joined the campaign. And we absolutely, it was one of the few instances where we sort of saw the 6 key messages or the 6 key asks of a campaign, and we were on board immediately. There wasn't even any question about what we were signing on to. And so that was really refreshing to see. And it's, I think, indicative of a lot of the work of coalition building that's been happening nationally over the last number of years. It was really great to see the polling results that Nick is going to share with us. They're really closely aligned with what we're seeing here in British Columbia. We had a poll a couple of months ago released that found that affordable housing was again the top issue for British Columbians ahead of the pandemic and economic recovery. We know that those two things are not detached from one another, but affordable housing is now the top priority for British Columbians. Once again, what's always interesting is to see the data on the number of people worried about paying for their housing costs next month. It's a staggering figure. And I suspect if we were to break that out by owners and renters, that number would be much higher amongst renters. So how all of this translates on voting day always remains to be seen. How people vote housing is going to remain to be seen. But I think that the Vote Housing campaign is really going to drive people there to the voting station or filling in their ballots at home and inform their vote with its excellent key messaging. So really happy to be a part of it. It's now my pleasure to introduce Richard O'Day, who is the communications advisor with FESHIM, which represents housing co-ops all over the Montreal region. And with that, I'll hand things over to you, Richard.
Merci, Jill. Oui, fédération effectivement bien connue comme la FESHIM, mais qui est aussi la fédération aujourd'hui en transition de l'habitation coopérative du Québec. La plupart de nos membres se trouvent dans la grande région de Montréal, mais on en a aussi ailleurs au Québec, principalement en Outaouais. On parle de 480 coopératives environ où vivent plus de 25 000 personnes. Les résultats du sondage dont j'ai pris connaissance, ça ne nous surprend pas, puis ça va dans le sens de ce qu'on ressent sur le terrain, des préoccupations de plus en plus grandes pour les enjeux du logement. Nous, on le voit chez nous, on l'a vu cet été, une forte demande de gens qui sont parfois en désarroi de devoir trouver un logement. Vous savez qu'au Québec, le 1er juillet, c'est la fête du Canada, mais c'est aussi le jour où de très nombreuses personnes déménagent. Et ce 1er juillet a encore été difficile pour des ménages à faible revenu. On le voit aussi dans les quartiers centraux qui deviennent de moins en moins accessibles aux populations à faible revenu ou même à revenu moyen. Donc, la financiarisation qui a un impact, des problématiques d'itinérance qui se sont manifestées encore plus fortement avec la pandémie. Donc, tout ça ne nous surprend pas, puis on le sent sur le terrain. Nous, on fait campagne à chaque année. On le faisait souvent seul. Et comme le disait Jill, je vais le répéter en français, nous aussi, on pense que l'union fait la force. On a réussi à créer une coalition, à réunir des gens qui, autrefois, travaillaient chacun de leur côté pour faire valoir ces intérêts-là. Donc, c'est clair qu'on pense qu'on est plus fort, mais on pense aussi que notre seule opinion, parce qu'on croit que ça fait longtemps que les Canadiens et les Canadiennes les Québécois pensent qu'on devrait investir plus dans le logement, qu'on devrait faire des choses. Mais là, on est au stade de pas seulement manifester notre opinion dans un sondage, mais se mobiliser pour que cette question-là revienne, que le logement soit au cœur de la campagne. Et oui, on a tous parfois peu de moyens dans nos petites organisations à travers le Canada, mais tous ensemble, on réussit à se créer voilà, une capacité d'agir. Puis je dirais que malgré nos différences, il y a un terrain d'entente qui fait consensus sur les priorités. Puis je vais préciser une chose pour les gens ici, au Québec en particulier. Ce qu'on veut, c'est des investissements fédéraux pour s'attaquer aux problématiques du logement et de l'itinérance. Il n'est pas question ici que le gouvernement fédéral embarque dans les compétences des provinces. On n'est pas là. Il n'y a personne au sein de la coalition qui remet en question le fait qu'il y a des façons de faire qui peuvent varier d'une façon à l'autre du pays. On poursuit tous un même objectif, puis l'objectif, c'est que le fédéral joue son rôle pour faire en sorte qu'on puisse, partout à travers le pays, s'attaquer à ces problématiques-là. Écoutez, ça fait un peu le tour. J'ai hâte d'avoir les résultats en détail. Je les ai vus rapidement, mais donc, je cède la parole, je crois. Est-ce que je la cède à Nick? Nick Nanos, je crois, qui va passer après moi. Est-ce que that's it, Tim?
You
will. That's correct.
Right on.
I'll let you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard and Jill. And I think, you know, one of the things that's striking about the campaign, I think, in my view, certainly, is that we have partners and members across the country. We see, you know, regional organizations, national organizations, lived experience organizations, individual agencies, and now thousands and thousands and thousands of Canadians signing on to the campaign and pledging to vote housing. And that is really, really exciting. And I think what we'll hear from Nick is that we can soon tap into a deep well of public support for investment in housing and ending homelessness. So with that, I'm going to introduce Nick from Nanos Research. Nick is one of the most distinguished and accomplished researchers and pollsters in Canada. We've worked with him in the past, and I know from my time dipping into and out of the Ottawa bubble that he's very well thought of in national circles and in political circles, and his work is recognized for its excellence. In addition to being the chairman of Nanos Research, he's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, and a research associate professor at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And so I am going to stop sharing, Nick, and let you take over.
Super, thanks, Tim, and hello, Jill and Richard. I'm very excited to share the survey. I'm going to share my screen. I don't think it gets quicker. We just finished this survey earlier this month, as in, I think, less than 10 days ago. And we wanted to not just share the results, but make sure the results get out in the public domain, because as you know, perhaps we might have an election. I don't know if you hear the dripping sarcasm from my voice, but we will be having an election. And now's the time, not just to grab the attention of those that are seeking public office, but to engage Canadians, because elections are times when they start to think about themselves, their loved ones, their neighborhoods, their communities. And, you know, the key takeaways, if there's some key takeaways from this study, what we have to make sure that we remember and that we repeat is that housing is on the radar for the vast majority of Canadians. There's a significant proportion of Canadians that are worried just about paying the rent or paying the mortgage. So housing affordability is very important to a significant proportion of Canadians. Also, it is urgent. This isn't something where we can kick the can to the future. People want action, and they want action as soon as possible. And, you know, when we think about different public policy priorities, the reality is that housing competes with healthcare, it competes with jobs, it competes with the environment. But what the research shows is that when people start thinking about housing and they think about homelessness, for example, that not only is it important, not only is it more likely to drive their vote, but that it is urgent. And I think that's one of the key messages, because many times in my work, you know, people are dealing with elected officials or people that are seeking public office, and they say, oh, we love the work that you do. You're such nice people. You do things that are really important, but there are other things. What's important, and why this survey is important, is to make sure that we drive home the point that not only is homelessness important, not only is affordable housing important, but it is an urgent priority that Canadians want action on. So let me advance a bit, and we have a little bit of a summary, so to speak, on the survey. And you know, one of the numbers that quite popped for me was you can see the number at the top of this page. 15% of Canadians are worried or somewhat worried about paying their housing costs. And why don't we just put that into context? Someone might say 15%, that's not really a lot. Well, to put that into context, factoring the number of adult Canadians that we have, we're talking about 4.9, almost 5 million Canadians that today are worried about just paying for their housing. And to put that into context, not to diminish the pandemic, according to StatsCan, there's been 1.4 million cases of COVID over the course of the pandemic. So if we think there's a pandemic or an epidemic related to kind of our health, multiply by 3.5 times the problem in terms of Canadians being worried about just being able to either pay the rent or pay for their mortgage in order to cover their cost of housing. This is not to diminish any other priorities, but this significantly impacts a pretty important portion of the Canadian electorate. And the other thing is to Jill's point, Jill talked about renters, and Jill, you were spot on in terms of renters. You can see that renters are 6 times more likely to be worried about paying their housing costs next month compared to those that are owning the home. So this is something that if you happen to be a renter, you are much more likely to be worried about paying the rent than homeowners. The other thing that really kind of jumps in terms of the survey is you can see 7 out of 10 Canadians believe that it's urgent to work to end homelessness and invest in affordable housing. And to put this into context, whoever happens to win the next election will probably win, and this isn't a prediction, so don't write this down on a piece of paper. 38%, with 37 or 38%, someone can win an election. Actually, the Liberals won the last election in terms of the House of Commons with 33. So just think, that's all that's needed to win an election, and you've got 70% of Canadians who believe that it's urgent to move on this. The other thing is that if you happen to be a voter that votes for parties such as the New Democrats and the Liberals, you can see that level of urgency is even exceptionally higher. And even among Conservatives, yes, it's lower, but the key takeaway is that more than 1 out of 2 Conservative voters, or likely Conservative voters, still believe that it's urgent to end homelessness. And you know, when we think about the possible solutions, you can see that a significant proportion of Canadians, more than 8 out of every 10, support or somewhat support investing in new affordable housing. And this support kind of is exceptionally high among Liberals and New Democrats, and even quite high, 7 out of every 10 Conservatives are good and would support building new affordable housing. And the other thing is that when we ask Canadians about their frame for any political party, regardless of who they are, on whether they would look kindly, why don't we just say look kindly or be supportive of a party that decided to focus on not just action and not just words, but concrete action to end homelessness, you can see that almost 8 out of every 10 Canadians would look positively on parties that decided to focus on this. And maybe another way to look at this is the reverse. For those parties that do not make this a priority, that's a political risk, kind of like political woe to you for Canadians who say that this is important, want urgent action, but you decide that you don't want to be not necessarily forthcoming, but proactive on this. And so what Canadians are looking for is to hear from all of the federal parties, what is their plan on housing? What is their plan on homelessness? How urgent is it for their party if they happen to form a government to advance their agenda? Those are the things that Canadians want to hear about. And let's do a little bit of a deeper dive, so to speak, on the numbers. So, you know, I'm not going to say the good news because, you know, it's not good news that it's an urgent priority. It speaks to the problem that we have. But the fact of the matter is that when we look at whether it's at the beginning of the pandemic or just most recently in the last 10 days, the level of urgency, which is exceptionally high, remains very high. And that only about 1 out of every 10 Canadians don't see any sort of urgency. So you can just think it's a factor of 7 to 1 in terms of urgency to act to end homelessness and invest in affordable housing compared to inaction. And the other thing is, you know, in these slides, we break out some of the other demographic groups and stuff like that. And I'd like to kind of put on the radar here, you know, check out some of the differences. And the most interesting difference is you can see women, and this is a score out of 10, what I'll say the urgency score out of 10, that women scored an 8.0 out of 10 in terms of urgency, where 10 was very urgent. And they are much more likely to identify the importance of working to end homelessness compared to men. That said, 6.7 out of 10, most politicians should and could and might take that to the bank. It's still a strong score among men, but that level of intensity of urgency is even higher among women. And you know, the other very interesting and important thing is that the support for spending money to help kind of through the pandemic recovery to kind of work on the affordable housing front through stimulus program actually also remains significantly strong. And for those data geeks, you might be asking, Nick, what's that net score thing? Plus 70.2, plus 71.6. That's the difference between those people that support and oppose. So just think, if the score was 0, we'd say Canadians are divided, polarized on an issue. At plus 70, you know, that's not quite a unanimous or consensus opinion, but it's exceptionally strong, which means that the support for action on this and investing in building new affordable housing and kind of linking that to stimulus is and remains exceptionally strong. And, you know, not a big surprise, and this is one of the key themes, you can see that women are more likely to like and support this initiative compared to men, but even among men, it's 8 out of every 10. So the numbers are strong, and you can see, you know, there's some minor regional variations, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter what part of the country that you live in. 8 out of every 10 of your friends, neighbors, colleagues, people that live in your community support what we're talking about in terms of building new affordable housing. And, you know, this is the breakdown on people being worried, or their level of worry about paying for your housing costs next month. And you can see that that level of worry has been consistent. You know, I'll put a little asterisk beside this, because this level of worry, and we talked about this, the worry, and we should just put the real number on this, which is 4.9 million Canadians worried about paying for housing costs next month, which is when the election will be occurring. Those 4.9 million Canadians, how worried will they be once the stimulus funding starts to wind down? What will it mean for homelessness? And I think this is probably why that sense of urgency is so strong. Many Canadians know that the support from the federal government to help Canadians weather through and pay their bills during the pandemic will be scaled back. At some point, they're going to be thinking about, if I'm worried now about paying my rent or for my housing next month, what is it going to be like 2 or 3 months from now, when potentially the stimulus and the support that Canadians have been relying on since the beginning of the pandemic is wound down? And, you know, you can see here, at least, that in terms of the level of worry, you know, one other thing, you know, Jill talked about renters. The other thing that's actually quite striking in the numbers, and this is where in the report that's posted on the Vote Housing website and also on the Nanos website, all the statistical tables are in the back, so you can really dig deep into a lot of the numbers. The other thing is, you know, Jill talked about renters. The other group that was more likely to be significantly worried or worried from an above average perspective happened to be individuals that lived in households with one person. So these single person households are much more likely to worry about paying for rent next month compared to households that have 2, 3, 4, or 5 individuals. And you can see here why that's important is that according to a survey, almost a full 1 out of every 4 Canadians live in households by themselves. And this puts more of what I'd say a bit more of a human face on what we're talking about. We're not just talking about renters, but we're talking about individuals who are solely and individually responsible for covering their housing costs without potentially having a partner or not living in a house with a family or having a roommate. So think of these one-person household situations as being kind of another kind of human element on the types of Canadians that are worried about paying for their housing costs in the next month. So I don't know, I can't see who's on the call, but if there are any elected officials or want to be elected officials, look at this slide, right? So you can see that 39% of Canadians, 4 out of every 10, say they would be more supportive, and then another 39% somewhat more supportive. That's almost 4 out of every 10 that would look kindly. And if you're looking at, and you know, I thought it was quite interesting that factoring the margin of error, that there's no real generational difference on this, that just as many young people as retired Canadians would look favorably on any type of political party that decided to engage and have some sort of concrete action plan to end homelessness and to build safe, affordable housing in Canada. But you can see if you happen to be female in the sample that you are much more likely to look kindly or positively on those political parties that were more likely to kind of engage in this particular space. And also, if you happen to be supportive of the Liberals or the New Democrats, the Bloc, the Green Party, and even swing voters, and this is another kind of crucial target group during an election. Everybody's talks about swing voters, people that are unsure who they might vote for. Well, you know what? If you want to try to get the support of Canadians that are non-committal to any of the main parties or any of the current political parties, you can see that one easy way to connect with those swing voters who are not committed would be to engage on this topic, because 3 out of every 4 of those swing voters would look kindly on candidates and parties that would propose concrete action to fight this issue. So this is my last slide, and I think I'm going to throw it back to Tim, and then we'll probably open it up for the chat if you have any questions. And I'd like to say my colleague Sarah Lafleur is on this call too. So if there's any question that I can't answer, the good news is Sarah can answer the question or at least get the stats. But the 4 big takeaways from the survey that we've just completed within the last 10 days, the national survey that we completed for the coalition that's driving this Vote Housing campaign, is that the sense of urgency is strong for action and remains consistent. That Canadians are very supportive of initiatives to build new affordable housing. Also, very importantly, a significant proportion of Canadians are outright worried about being able to pay for their housing in the next month. And you know, the number, if we were to project that out to the population, is a significant 4.9 million Canadians. And you know, you have to think of this as, you know, you walk down in your neighborhood, and 1 out of every 6 or 1 out of every 7 of your neighbors, when you say hello to in the morning when you're walking to get a coffee or going to do your groceries, in the back of their mind, there's a cloud hanging over them because they're not even sure, or they're worried about whether they're going to be able to pay for their housing in the next 30 days. And the other thing is that this is not just an urgent issue, not just an important issue, not just an issue which impacts almost 5 million Canadians. Canadians would look kindly and positively on any politician or party that decided to put not just words on the table and not just a plan, but to see action and concrete proposals to have more affordable housing and to fight to end homelessness. So with that, Tim, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to throw it back to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Nick. This is fascinating, and I got there was I was actually pretty surprised at how strong the support was for ending homelessness and investing in housing. I'm curious. You know, you've been doing this for a long time. Been polling this and poll on a load of different issues. Were there any surprises in this for you? And were there, like, how does this compare to other issues that you poll on?
Well, first of all, I always talk about proximity issues, you know, and when it's like proximity, how close is an issue to people's day-to-day lives? And I hope I don't offend anyone that happens to be a diplomat or into foreign policy, but foreign policy issues are very important, but they don't always impact people's day-to-day lives. But when we're talking about housing, it affects everyone, period, full stop, without exception. And the other thing is that even if you happen to be someone where you're personally not worried about paying for the rent or paying for housing, you probably have a friend, you probably have a loved one. You're wondering how your kids are going to pay the rent and whether they can afford what type of housing that they can afford. And it's real. And I think the other part of the subcontext here, Tim, is that I think people have had enough. They're kind of wondering, why can't we just focus on this? There's so many things that we can do as a country if we focus on an issue. And you know, the other thing is that we know this from a lot of our other work. When we think about homelessness, it's not a big city thing anymore. There's homelessness in small towns. There's homelessness in rural areas. So this isn't something that is kind of like I'll call it the 1970s intercity stuff where, oh, you know, you happen to be in downtown. I won't even say a city. You happen to live in the downtown, and homelessness was part of the environment. The fact of the matter is, homelessness now exists everywhere in Canada, not just in the big cities, but in small towns, in the suburbs, and even in rural areas where, you know, we need action to fight homelessness basically everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. So just a note for folks, if you have a question for Nick or I, please post them in the Q&A. We're going to go through some of those questions in a sec. And we'll also just ask my colleagues on the line here, we'll post links to where all of this research is in the chat so everyone can get a hold of it and have a deeper look. A couple of questions came up relative in particular to Bloc Québécois and Green Party voters. We talked a lot about, you know, the NDP and the Liberals and the Conservatives. How would you summarize the support in those other two parties?
Oh, still exceptionally strong. And, you know, let's face it, if more than 60 to 70% of those committed supporters in your party are want to see action on homelessness, you know, you should not be avoiding that if you happen to be the leader of that party. And I guess I guess the, you know, the key takeaway here is that, you know, even half of Conservatives, so, you know, which is still a significant proportion, want to see action and believe that it's and are supportive of and are actually like 70% of Conservatives are supportive of concrete action. So, you know what, if anybody was part of a political movement and 70% of the people that are part of your movement said, you know, we really need action. This is an urgent problem. People are worried about paying for housing. So this should be on the agenda, not just in terms of parties mobilizing their own supporters, but it should be in terms of parties wanting to grow support. Like parties, I look at numbers like this, and smart politicians would be ambitious on this issue. Like, why can't we be ambitious on providing a basic fundamental human need that everyone, without exception, needs housing. So it cuts basically across all the parties, which is good. And this speaks to the importance. This isn't a partisan issue. It's not right, left, right? Mm-hmm. It's not kind of polarized. We're not polarized on this. This is an issue that cuts across parties. It cuts across generations. It cuts across gender. It cuts across regions, and it's not political. And that's why I think what people want is action. Less politics, more action on this.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's go to the questions here. There's a few questions, Karim and Jane and Selma are asking, what brought us to this problem in the first place? What are some of the policies that created homelessness? And, we can't expect this to be fixed from a federal level. And I think I'll summarize those by saying, modern mass homelessness in Canada and Canada's housing crisis was really created beginning in the 1980s and into the 1990s when the federal government withdrew from housing investment. And that's why we're putting such an emphasis on this campaign and putting pressure on the federal government to re-engage and lead on this issue, because it was, the federal government withdrawal from housing investment really was the genesis of modern mass homelessness. Yes, there is elements of provincial policy and municipal policy absolutely involved in this, and there's no silver bullets, but we know that a key factor in solving the problem is going to be getting the federal government re-engaged. And if we're successful with vote housing, there's no reason why of this vote housing effort, this movement that we create, couldn't be turned on those other levels of government to help engage them, because this, as you're seeing, the data that Nick is presenting, is going to be true whether you're in a federal election, a provincial election, or a municipal election. It's just the range of policy options at those different levels will be slightly different. Michael was asking, has any concern been raised about housing for seniors and those who don't want to end up in a retirement home? I don't know, Nick, if that would have come out in that survey. But
not in this survey, but we've done some other work for some of your friends, might even be on this call, related to seniors housing, and that's also kind of, the whole idea of creating a, people generally want to live in their homes as long as possible, and that's feasible. And the question is, and this is where, what I'll say, public health and housing affordability intersect, right? Because, if people can't afford to age in their own homes, who cares if the government sets up programs to help seniors age in home, because they can't afford it, because it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. So, and I think there's, so we know from some of the other research, so why don't I say stay tuned, there'll be some more research that'll be released in the next while from one of your partner organizations on seniors housing and kind of living in housing, but it's the same type of issue. But to go back to my previous point, it's like seniors are worried about it, young people are worried about it, middle-aged people are either directly worried about it or indirectly worried about it because their mom and dad have housing costs, or their kids are trying to pay for rent as they try to make ends meet. So this cuts across generations.
Awesome. Betsy is wondering, is there any indication of cynicism among voters polled? Like, she's thinking about our history of promises made and promises not kept.
Yeah, how's that? I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but I think, and Tim, this goes back to your comment about the role of the federal government. The last thing that Canadians want to hear is that, oh, this is not a federal responsibility. We're really sorry. Yeah. This is a provincial or municipal responsibility. The fact of the matter is that not just on this issue, but on all the really big, important issues, people expect the federal government to lead. The Prime Minister has convening power. Whoever happens to be the Prime Minister can say what they think is important and to mobilize other levels of government for action. It doesn't mean that the federal government is going to solve this with one big check. Mm-hmm. But the question is, think of the pandemic. Healthcare is primarily a provincial responsibility. It's delivered in our communities. But if the federal government didn't engage on trying to be a catalyst for getting vaccinations, mobilizing the premiers, working in consultation with the premiers, we'd be in a big mess. So, you know, I think the message here is that if any politician says, well, it's the provinces and stuff like that, I think we should kind of, pressure should be put on them to say, yes, it is a joint responsibility, but you have convening power. Are you willing to use that convening power to fight homelessness and to help to have affordable housing for Canadians? And can you step up and not just write a check, but step up to convene and mobilize a real discussion on this?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I've often joked that housing and homelessness is the political equivalent of a high school dance. Everybody's standing along the wall, staring at their feet, waiting for someone else to make the first move. You know, and I think it's important that here we put the pressure now on the feds to kick them into the middle of the floor to start the dance. Tom is asking us, when the time comes, what's the plan to release these numbers publicly and put the parties and campaigns on the spot to respond? Tom, all of the results of the poll have been shared with the parties already. We sent that to them earlier today. They're going to see a copy or a recording of this webinar as well, and we're going to be pushing the results out through our channels. And I think part of, you know, pushing the parties to be on the spot to respond is where we need all of you to make sure that they hear from all of us. We hear the pledges about housing, but we also hear that say, look, you know, Canadians are supporting this in huge numbers. What are you going to do? So it's kind of right back at you, Tom. We kind of need your help to get the word out. And
we need everybody to retweet, post on Facebook, post on social media. Exactly. to talk about the results. So think of this as a slow burn. You want a slow burn throughout the election so that you can keep reminding. And can I tell you something about politicians? Sometimes they don't get it the first time. So we got to repeat. Got to repeat and keep at them. You know, as some of you might know, I have 4 kids, and there's a saying in the Nanos family is one of the kids said to me, Dad, you only have to say yes once. You know what? For our prime minister, the prime minister only has to say yes once to have a real concrete action plan on fighting homelessness and creating affordable housing. Because once they say yes, things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Vernon's asking, why do you think there's such a big gap between the Conservatives versus other parties?
Well, I think part of that is ideological. And just remember, this party, the Conservative Party, is amalgam for Tim, you'll remember this, and I'll remember this because I was going to say we both have gray hair, but you do have a gray beard. So anyways, you know, the Conservatives are an amalgam of the old Reform Canadian Alliance and the Progressive Conservatives. You might be surprised to see in some of those numbers, it's like 50-50. And that's because there's part of the Conservative Party, and, you know, these are valid opinions. Part of the Conservative Party doesn't think that the government really has a role, that, you know, they want more of a free market, less of an interventionist approach. They believe that less government is good government. But you can see even within that Conservative Party, they're half are like, we need the government to intervene. This is an urgent problem and we need the government to intervene. But there's still people, so it's a little lower. So should we be disappointed that one party did not have as high an intensity as the other? No, because that's the way the cookie crumbles, right? We can't expect everyone. And I'll tell you, if the Conservative numbers were as good as the other ones, someone would be saying, hey, Nick, can we trust this poll? Are you telling us that all of the Conservatives love this stuff? But the fact of the matter is, this is still on the radar for a very significant proportion of Conservatives. Enough so that if you were the leader, happen to be the leader of the Conservative Party, you should be paying attention to this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if you're a leader of a Conservative Party, you're looking at what the supporters of other parties are supporting, because you need to bring some of them over to you in order to win.
And the swing voters we were talking about, right? Those people that are uncommitted, right? Because, you know, one thing that we do know, and this is just a statement of fact, not a controversial comment, but for the Conservatives to win an election, they need swing voters to temporarily decide that they want to vote with the Conservatives as an alternative to the Liberals. Mm-hmm. So if you're a Conservative strategy and you're looking at these numbers, you have to be thinking, how can affordable housing fit into a growth strategy? And then if you're like a Liberal or New Democrat or Bloc or Green Party supporter, you're thinking about how does our strategy on affordable housing and homelessness mobilize our people to come out and vote.
For sure. Steve's got an interesting question, and this may go to some other polling you're doing in terms of how voters see government spending. But Steve's asking, given the cost to end homelessness, do we know if Canadians support increased spending or taxation to end homelessness?
Well, I think this is where there has to be some sort of concreteness to the plan. And, you know, most Canadians, it's kind of everything. It's like a lot of surveys that we do. You know, you ask Canadians, do you want lower taxes? You'd say yes, but then we'd say, oh, does that mean that maybe you won't have access to universal health care, or you'll have to wait in line for something? And then it's kind of like, no, I don't. And I think this is where if Canadians, and you know, the one thing about this type of infrastructure investment is that Canadians can see it, right? If we do a better job at housing affordability and we do a better job at fighting homelessness, this isn't going to be like something that no one will ever see, like the money went out the door and no one will see the fact of the matter is, and this is because this particular issue touches everyone, the fact of the matter is that people will know that their kid can afford paying the rent, and they'll know that their mom and dad can stay in their home as longer because they can afford to stay in a home and not go into a care facility. So I think from a political perspective, not only does there need to be an ask, but there needs to be a plan to show Canadians not just how the money was spent, but the impact that it has. And I think, you know, politically, you know, the good news is that in a lot of our polling that we've done, even when we talk about social housing, infrastructure, people are more likely to be supportive of infrastructure because they can see the impact, as opposed to other things where it's hard to see the impact.
Yeah, in a poll that you did for us last year, we asked respondents, and Eileen is asking this question, is asking respondents if they knew someone who had been homeless or if they'd been homeless themselves. We didn't ask that this time, but in those previous numbers, I recall it was about 36% of Canadians either knew somebody who had been homeless or had experienced it themselves. That was a pretty surprising number.
Yeah,
well, a lot of people.
Yeah, well, it speaks to the fact this is not an intellectual exercise. It's real. And, you know, the thing is that, you know, because it has to do with housing, I think that's why there's that sense of urgency and why it really strikes a chord with a lot of Canadians, because if someone is homeless, you know, even if you have a loved one that's homeless for a short period of time, or if you have a loved one that misses a rent payment or can't find a place to live, it's not something that you forget about. It's not something that's kind of like, oh yeah, that was last month, I forgot about that. It's something that realistically, if it's a friend or someone that you care for or love, you carry that with you forever, even if it's just once. So, and I think it's because this is so close to people's day-to-day lives. So, you know, this is, you know, this goes back to, you know, whether people directly or indirectly, they're plugged into this and they care about this issue.
I guess there's a question or two about your methodology or about the results, and a couple of folks are asking if the data can be broken down by ridings or in addition to province. But I'm go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Tim, do you want to answer the question?
No, I'm not the
Sorry. I thought you were going to answer, and then I was going to add extra stuff to make your answer look brilliant. So yes,
it's going to take a little more than that for me to.
We did a national survey, so that we don't have results by riding, but it's representative of the country. We have provincial and regional results. So for the larger provinces like Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, there are discrete samples that you'd be able to see in the back on how British Columbians responded to the results. And then we have the regions, the Atlantic region, and then also the prairies. And please forgive any of my friends in the prairie provinces. I'm sorry that I have to put you together, but you seem to be generally a happy bunch sometimes. And statistically, it makes the regional sample a little more robust. I also saw in the feed questions on how the survey was done, and very briefly, it's a hybrid survey, which means that we recruit people calling land and cell lines, so live people talking to other live people, and then they're recruited to do surveys online, because I'm a really big believer in the human interaction in the research process. And as a result, there's a margin of error plus or minus 3.1 percentage points 19 times out of 20.
Great. Interesting question from Jane, and she's saying, well, what's keeping the feds from saying, yes, they know about this problem, what's in it for them to keep the status quo? And I guess I would add to that, based on what you're seeing, if you're any of the federal parties, you're looking at their own internal polling, your polling, all of your competitors, they're juggling, I'm guessing that they're juggling a zillion different issues. What's rising to the top from them? And so what maybe keep them from saying yes is all of the other things that they may be trying to say yes to. But how do we cut through that?
In my experience, and I've worked on a lot of files, every file that succeeds needs champions, not a champion, champions. Mm-hmm. Group of individuals. They can be elected officials, they can be advocates, they could be whoever, that are relentless and merciless in pursuing kind of what I'll say the objective. And in this particular case, it has to do with affordable housing and fighting homelessness. And the fact of the matter is that there are lots of examples of politicians that have what I'll say personal causes. And I also saw in the feed someone saying, it's too bad that Adam Vaughan is not running because he was into this particular issue. So he's an example of a champion. So one of the things that the coalition that's working on kind of advancing this should think about is, we shouldn't think of this as kind of like we need the prime minister to do this, because getting to the prime minister is very difficult, and the prime minister has a lot of competing interests. And also a lot of people coming at him. So maybe another way to think about it is, who can be our champions? Who are the politicians and candidates that are willing to stand up and champion this cause, and then to put a spotlight on them? And in the ideal world, it would cut across parties. It would not be just one party. It would be multiple parties. And I think, if I may make one suggestion, is that this group be ecumenical. You should be welcoming anyone that is willing to do something to fight homelessness and create an environment for affordable housing should be welcome, and they should be mobilized. So I think that's I think it's hard to get to the prime minister just because of the chair that they sit in, but think of champions around the prime minister. And the same thing is around the different party leaders, star candidates, members of their caucus that might have had a personal experience that motivates them to act on this really important issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting when we think about the number of Canadians who have experienced homelessness or housing need. I know with absolute certainty there are folks in government and opposition in most, if not all, parties who have either lived in co-op housing, lived in social housing, or know somebody who's experienced homelessness that are close to them. And those, they're no different than the rest of us. And, Robert's asking, are the vote housing partners, do we have a sense that the political parties may clearly support measures, and will they be specific with precise measures and outcomes? It's what's interesting to me, and I think there's some of my colleagues on the line would echo this, but the conversations we've had with all parties are very different than the conversations we would have had even in the last election about housing. We know that all parties have talked to us about ideas about housing measures that they can implement. So I actually think we'll be pleasantly surprised to see the housing platforms coming out from all parties. But, you know, as Nick says, we have to be ecumenical. We have to really push. And, you know, it's not enough for us to wish for the change to happen, to want a change to happen. We really have to make that change happen. Well, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Nick, I want to thank you very much for this. I know there's a lot of other questions and comments out there for you, but I know your time is precious, so I will let you go. But just to say thank you very, very much for this presentation and for all of your work on this, Paul. It's a huge, it gives us, I think, it shows us, as I said, you know, public opinion is with us, but that change doesn't happen because we want it to. As you said, we gotta make it happen. We gotta push people to do that. And that's where I'm gonna sort of turn to everyone on the line and say, you know, we really need you to ensure that all parties hear from us, right? We really need you to pledge to vote housing, to volunteer at votehousing.ca/volunteer, and to reach out to your friends and your colleagues and everyone in your networks. One of the things that underpins this campaign is a belief that everybody can be their own campaign, can be their own campaign manager. And we need you to reach out to your networks, get others to votehousing.ca and to pledge. And with you, we can be successful. We can make sure that ending homelessness and housing need in Canada is a priority for the next federal government. So I want to thank all of our partners. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Jill, sorry, and Richard, Sarah, and Nick for joining us today. Thank you to our partners at the CHRA, CHF Canada, and the Lived Experience Leadership Network. Thank all of you for attending. Recording of this webinar will be posted on the Vote Housing website and distributed by email. And we will be in touch with all of you very, very soon. Thank you all. Have a terrific day. I look forward to making sure that the end to homelessness and housing need in Canada happens very, very soon. Thank you all.